So my name is Martine. I'm a communication studies professor here at CSU and the director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation. So I'll be the initial presenter today, and then we have a panel that you see on the top that will be kind of responding and talking about this developing idea of deliberative journalism. The Deliberative Journalism Project actually started last fall. It was an initial collaborative process between the CBD, between the Coloradan, which is the local newspaper here, the Department of Journalism and Media Communication here at CSU, and the Political Science Department here at CSU. We got an initial grant from the American Press Institute to kind of exploring, working together to kind of take on some of the challenges of local journalism and the challenges of democracy, two kind of dual crises that I'll talk about a little bit today that we're trying to kind of respond to. Also, I want to kind of mention briefly the support from American Press Institute and from the Kettering Foundation, which has supported this work and supported my work for years, and the Bohemian Foundation locally, which has always been a supporter of the CBD. Just to kind of note how a lot of this work, collaboration and philanthropy kind of really can help do these things that we need to do to help with our community. That core collaboration with those four entities has grown in the last few months. So we now have membership in the kind of core team of the collaborative project from the public libraries here in Fort Collins, from the Fort Collins Public Media. This is actually streaming live on the public access channel right now. We're connecting now with KUNC, which is the radio station focused here in Northern Colorado as well. And also the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures here at CSU, particularly Andrea Purdy, who is helping us connect with the Spanish-speaking community to make sure that we're as broad as possible and as inclusive with the growing Spanish community here in Fort Collins. And I just remembered I talked too quickly, so I need to slow down. My normal speed, I'm an Argentinian, I get excited, so I start talking pretty quickly, but I promised I would not do that as much. Right? So I'm going to share my screen briefly here to give you a overall kind of picture of what we'll be doing here for the next 2 hours. We do have Spanish translation on the slides as we're kind of going through for those. So pretty simple process. I'm going to give an initial presentation. I'm going to keep it hopefully at most about 30 minutes once I get going to lay out some of the kind of basic principles of the work of the Center for Public Deliberation. Some key things about this notion of deliberative engagement that we've been refining for about the last 15 years. Right? Then we'll have a panel responding to this. The panel is a panel of journalists and journalism educators that will be kind of talking, responding to these ideas, adapting these ideas, talking about how their current work is already doing some of these things. I'm not pretending to kind of know something brand new, but basically a conversation for the last 3/4 of this, of really starting to refine this idea of deliberative journalism. And by deliberative journalism, this isn't all journalism is going to be deliberative. This is a subset of journalism that really, from the initial definition that we're looking at, is journalism that's particularly focused on helping local communities have the kind of conversations they need to have to take on their shared problems more effectively. Right? So deliberation is all about sparking the conversations we need for democracy to work, which, as I'll talk about a little bit today, don't happen naturally. Right? So how does the community step up? How do newsrooms step up? How do universities, libraries, all these organizations that have a civic commitment, how do we step up and work together to make sure our community has the capacity and the resources to have these conversations so we can take on our issues? So then at the end, there is a Q&A function set up through Zoom. So you'll be able to kind of ask questions there if you want. I've got one of my students, Ashley, who'll be kind of watching that as we go. I also set up a resource page. Ashley can kind of post on the chat that link, or she might have already. We just, a lot of things I'll mention, some of the resources and the websites of our panelists are on there. If things come up in conversation, we might kind of add those, and you'll also have access to that afterwards. We'll post this on YouTube, and it'll be streaming kind of, and we'll have that link. So just if you want to dig a little bit deeper on some of the things that we're talking about, you have that link. So Ashley will be posting links as we go in the chat. If you're one of those that want to be multitasking and kind of checking it out, but you'll have all the links that she posts available to you on there. Not all of those will be available in English. Some of them are. So there is some Spanish on that resource link, but a lot of those are links to websites or individual articles that have not been translated yet. So you see the panelists on the side. So we'll bring them up in about 30 minutes or so and get a chance to kind of hear from them from lots of different perspectives. These are people doing some great innovative work in Colorado that we're excited to kind of hear from them and see how we can kind of move this conversation forward. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now for a second. And yeah, so to start with a little bit more of my own background. So my work now, almost for the last 20 years, has focused on how do we have the conversations we need to have for democracy to work, particularly conversations across perspectives, particularly tough conversations on controversial issues. My initial academic training was in argumentation. So I really look at how people make arguments, how do people defend their perspectives, how do they try to kind of convince each other, and then try to understand how those arguments work, make distinctions between, particularly strong arguments or weak or problematic arguments. And that both looks at kind of traditional argumentation in terms of the quality of the source and the logic and avoiding fallacies and those type of things. But I've also always been really interested in the power of stories and the power of emotion. And a big part of what we'll talk about today is I've done a lot of work on how people use values to try to make arguments, to try to convince people, and how, when used well, values can really bring us together in some powerful ways. But unfortunately, values are often more used as weapons or framed in specific kind of strategic ways that unfortunately make it more difficult for us to kind of see our connections. And bad kind of value arguments can divide us and create a lot of the problems that we're dealing with, right? So a lot of the work with deliberative journalism will be, how do we kind of think a little bit more deeply about how we talk about our values and about the value tensions and the differences we have, and building that capacity in our community. The overall, the initial development of the Deliberative Journalism Project, and the CPD has now been around for around 15 years. Big part of it was kind of a growing crisis in democracy because of the increased polarization and hyper-partisanship, the lack of trust in almost all our institutions. That trust has just been dying. That includes universities, that includes media, certainly, and politics and politicians and everything. So that leads to this inability to engage each other. That leads to simple stories and conspiracy theories, and democracy really requires us to be able to have tough conversations, and we're seeing particularly that ability is really slipping, and that distracts us from the real issues that we really need to be able to take on. Now, those problems are particularly difficult at the national level, but we're seeing more and more of that bleeding down to the local level and happening more and more. So a lot of our work is how at the local level do we change that. In addition, there's certainly been a crisis in local journalism and in local news. We talked a lot about this in the meetings in the fall that launched the Deliberative Journalism Project. But there's been basically a collapse of the traditional financial model with the internet, with Google, and with Facebook, and with so many different things kind of drawing our attention. The ability for a local newspaper to survive and fulfill all the functions that a local community needs it to fulfill has become more and more difficult. I know the statistics are in different places, but the last one I looked up is over 1,000 papers have folded in the last 12 years. And almost all newspaper newsrooms have had significant cuts in staff. More than half the people that used to work in newspaper newsrooms no longer work there just from the last 10 or 15 years. Now, that's a lot of bad news. Thankfully, tonight is actually much more optimistic, right? And one of the reasons for that is because the state of Colorado is really at the forefront of a lot of innovations to think differently about this. And we'll hear from some of the panelists kind of talking about that. And just while these dual crises of democracy and journalism, unfortunately, can kind of create a negative feedback loop. The negatives of one can make it harder the other and kind of cycle down. The opposite is also true. that there's a potential for a positive feedback loop or a virtuous cycle, that as we start strengthening local journalism, that should strengthen local democracy and vice versa. So a lot of the work that we're trying to do at the CPD and with the Deliberative Journalism Project is kind of turn that table, right, and switch from this vicious cycle, negative cycle, to a positive cycle, and figuring out ways of doing that. And across the country, really across the world, the crisis in local journalism has kind of struck a chord, and there's more and more people wanting to talk about it, thinking about how to fund that, thinking about how to get innovative, and we're excited to be kind of part of that process kind of moving forward. Right? So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen now, and I'm going to lay out, some of these kind of key concepts in deliberation, concepts and tools that we've been using at the CPD. Now, I often teach these in a 15-week course, right? Or an all-day workshop, or maybe like a 2-hour talk. But I just kind of pick some highlights really quickly just to give our panelists something to kind of react to and see. I did number all these, so the panelists, if there's something that you see that you really want to talk about later, just kind of remember the number, and then I can easily pop this back up if we want to dig into a little bit more. I think Ashley probably has also posted I saved a PDF of the PowerPoint that y'all have the link to if y'all want to dig in a little bit more kind of on your own. Right? So I'm going to try, we'll see if I get through. I want to cut myself off after 30 minutes, but I want to talk about 4 key concepts that I think might be interesting to really dig into the intersection between my deliberation world and the journalism world. So the first, I'm going to talk a little bit about wicked problems, which gets into that values, how to talk about values concept that I mentioned. Then I'm going to talk about some basic deliberation processes that have been particularly informed from kind of research on social psychology and human nature. A lot of our work now is particularly designed to avoid triggering the worst part of human nature, these negative quirks in our brain, and actually tap into the best. And part of what we've learned as we studied that is, unfortunately, most public process doesn't do that, right? Most public process tends to bring out the worst in us. So deliberative processes try to change that, and that's certainly something that we're hoping to bring to journalism. How do we develop journalism at the local level that really can bring out the best in us and help undermine the worst, right? Then I talk a little bit about one particular model that I've been spending a lot of time on that helps think about the stages of the kind of talk that we need to take on our issues, called the Kaner model. It's a basic model that we teach our students in terms of facilitation, but I'm using it now really to kind of think about community capacity and how we kind of build that. And the 6 key tasks, which is the last thing I'll talk about that we introduced in the meetings in the fall, are kind of built off of that. But these are initial things that we're thinking as we've launched this project that we'll focus on, that I'm really excited to kind of hear some of the response from the panelists about which of those really jump out at them and excite them about some potential new paths for journalism. Right? So we'll start with this idea of wicked problems. And again, I'm going to do the short version here to make sure we don't take too much time. There's been a literature on this concept of wicked problems now for almost 50 years, coming from like civil engineers and city planners. The story that's told was, they got their degree and then they went to work for a city, and they found out pretty quickly that the kind of problems that they were trained to solve and the kind of problems they were asked to solve were very different, right? So they felt that they were trained to solve these technical problems, these what they called tame problems, actually, that there was an answer to, right? So you just get smart people together and come up with the answer and then just, implement it as efficiently as possible. But they realized, working with cities, with real communities, that most of the problems were wicked in the sense of they involved lots of different values and lots of different things people cared about that didn't fit together very well. And then different people in different groups would rank those values and prioritize those differently. So there wasn't a technical solution. There wasn't a right way to kind of fix it. So that led to the realization that we need to talk about issues very differently. Right. The best way to always explain this is with an example. So this is an example that we've been working with for quite a long time here, because water is a wicked problem in northern Colorado. We don't get enough water. Right? So this is an actual slide. I create these wicked problem slides. Sometimes just internal for our project. Sometimes we use them like this one as part of our process when we engage the public. But the idea is to really as you're reading people engage in the issues, you're making sense of the noise out there, whether that's on message board, on a newspaper, whether that's survey results, whether that's going through different websites, whether that's listening to one at a time at the microphone at a city council meeting. We have all these opportunities for people to express their individual opinion. So I try to make sense of all those and identify the underlying value that's often not explicit, right? It's often implied, and bring that out and put it on the table, right? So this is kind of my analysis as we engage that issue for a few months before our first meeting, just to try to understand when people talked about water, what did they care about? What was important to them? And we lay out these 9 things that kind of came to the top. This shows a wicked problem in a couple different ways. One is if you look at these things one at a time, none of these are bad, right? The problem isn't bad people with bad values necessarily from a wicked problems frame. It's that, we want lots of good things, but what makes it wicked is these don't fit together. And there's natural tension that we focus on one of these boxes and makes it harder to focus on another box, right? The problem is that the typical conversations we have, the way our brains are wired, the way most of our processes kind of are set up, the way some of the loudest voices kind of tend to see things, is they like to frame things as only one of these at a time, right? To frame it as I care about the health of the river, therefore anyone who disagrees with me is anti-river, right? And so we have a lot of these individual conversations based on one value at a time, either sometimes subconsciously, sometimes purposely, sometimes purposely manipulative, that dominate our conversation as I spend a lot of time, again, listening to public discourse. So what we try to do in the CBD is set up 3 different kind of conversations. The long-term conversation, we need this balancing conversation about how do we find the right balance between these, right? That there's not a right answer to this. We're also not saying that every value is just as good as everyone else, but we have to have this long-term conversation of thinking about how to balance and how to tweak. The short-term conversation might be more of a recalibrating, that we need a significant shift, that maybe one value is dominated too much, or one value has been left behind, or maybe a new value has come up that we haven't thought of. So this kind of combines more of a civil deliberative conversation about balancing with a stronger activism one, that we need to change things, at least in the short term. But at least that change within this broader notion of many values. Or ideally, we have this transcending conversation, that we get creative and innovative and find ways of transcending those tensions. But as we've done this work, we just realized we don't naturally have the balancing or the recalibrating or the transcending conversation if we have that simpler conversation available to us of framing it as I've got values and the people disagree. And we're seeing that more and more as I look at different kind of tools out there of talking across difference. We love defining the people we disagree with by what they're against, right? Rather than really kind of understanding what they're for and kind of reframing it, right? So a couple other quick ones I'll just show you before we move on with this first one. Healthcare can be very complex, but in some ways we want those 3 things, and those 3 things don't fit together very well, right? But we don't like to talk about those tensions. Capitalism, or the idea of sustainability, in a way, is a wicked problem. We want to support profit in the economy. We want to support people. And we want to support the environment. But those 3 things don't fit together very well. And the story of this is an important one, because the idea of the triple bottom line of caring about all 3 of those was initially developed by environmental activists that realized if it stayed adversarial, if it stayed the economy against the environment, they felt long term that they were not going to be in a good shape, because the economy had a lot more power and kind of money. So they reframed it and decided, let's not demonize profit. Let's not demonize kind of the economy, but let's talk about the need to kind of balance those 3. And I like to show this one because it shows that particular importance, or the possibility of transcendence, that we transcend this tension between the economy and the environment. Now they're working together. And especially Northern Colorado, where green jobs is critical to our economy and to our university, it creates a win-win-win, that a high-paying green job is good for people, good for the environment, and good for the economy, right? Lastly, I'll quickly, from the preambles of the Constitution, there's some pretty big values embedded in there as we seek to we're never going to have the perfect union, but we can kind of seek towards trying to form a more perfect one. We're always trying to find the right balance between these. But if you take those values and you look at them kind of, define them a little bit more modern terms, once again, this is a wicked problem. If you take these one at a time, these are all good things. but they don't fit together very well. And there's natural tensions between these. We talk about these terms all the time as bases of arguments that unfortunately kind of divide us. But if we see them more as tensions that we have to negotiate, that long term we're trying to work together in our communities to balance these things, it starts transforming the conversation, starts opening up space for us to have very different conversations about how we deal with these things. And so the work that I do from this first point of a wicked problems lens of the world is you're retraining your brain to look for the tensions. As people talk past each other, how do you identify those tensions and put them on the table and make that part of the conversation and give people kind of the resources they need to have the conversation about engaging those tensions. And then others, right? Those are 5 from just those kind of American values. But as you start kind of looking at the world, you realize how so many of the toughest issues that we're dealing with have some inherent tensions below them that are the heart of the issue, but are rarely discussed. So our job is to bring that out, thinking about how can journalism kind of focus on that in certain ways to start transforming our conversations. The end of this kind of first big point, which is the longest point, is to deal with wicked problems well, we need to be able to have some tough conversations. We want to tap into human creativity, and we need to kind of rely on collaborative action. We need actors, a broad range of actors across different perspectives. We need public and private and nonprofit. So how do we start building capacity in our communities to have these kind of conversations and tap into that in productive ways? So second thing I'm going to get into now, kind of playing off that, is this notion of thinking about deliberative process design, in particular, thinking about what we know about human psychology and brain science, right? If these few minutes are interesting to people, I've got a couple of articles you can kind of dig into. I got a long report that I wrote that really dug into the weeds here. But I spent about 2 years really digging into the social psychology and brain science to understand how our brains are wired, and then how do we design processes, particularly with that knowledge in mind. And a big part of that research, unfortunately, uncovered a lot of bad news, right? So these themes that you see on your screen are some of the stronger impulses of how our brains are wired that inherently make it difficult for us to have tough conversations and often lead to the polarization and the partisanship and the divisiveness and the lack of trust that we're getting in our democratic kind of society right now, right? Our brains are wired once we make a decision to kind of be consistent and to protect that. Our brains are wired for simple stories, right? We'll talk about this a little bit later with Michael, right? Thinking about how simple stories can sometimes really drive a lot of the division. But we also know listening to each other's stories can sometimes be the one thing that can get us out of that and bring us together, right? So how do we kind of look at how stories are told and how they can help us have these tough conversations? We're wired to be on teams, to be in groups with like-minded people. And those first 3 things work together really strongly, that I've got my team and my team's the good team, their team's the bad team, and we're certain of it. And for that 4th one, as an argumentation scholar, it really kind of influences how we process information and how we seek out information and how we make sense of and store information and recall information. All of that is influenced by these biases that really prefer a simple story, right? And prefer in a lot of ways, framing issues as of only 1 or 2 values are relevant. And the people that disagree with me disagree because they're rejecting a positive value, right? And then that last point, which gives you a sense of, the first point I made tonight was making the argument that the best way to think about tough issues is to really focus on the underlying values and the inherent tensions. And that we know is exactly what our brain is not designed to do very well naturally, right? So that means we need to help people build the capacity, the habits to do this, right? But the reality is, once you understand wicked problems and understand kind of the human nature, you realize how so many of the processes we rely on to talk about public issues, to bring people together, clearly tend to kind of exacerbate, make those worse, right? Really tap into those negative parts, light up those parts of the brain, whether it's a 2-party system, whether it's social media, whether it's one at a time in the microphone, or whether it's more kind of partisan media in a sense, which people are going to be naturally drawn to journalism that tells them what they want to think, right? And if we all start having our own sources, that gets really dangerous. So this really starts to kind of establish the huge importance of having a local journalism source, ecosystem at the local level that avoids that and serves as something to kind of bring people together. So with this process, we're looking at these 4 shifts that we try to do in our work, that we shift from this easy assumption of wicked people to the more kind of nuanced, complex assumption of putting the wickedness in the problem. And I'll briefly say here, I'm not saying there's not wicked people. Right? I'm kind of saying 2 things. One is that our brain is going to make the assumption that we want to kind of go to the place it's wicked people, right? Because that absolves us of some tough choices and conversations. But even if the issue is truly kind of caused by wicked people or bad faith actors behind the scenes or powerful people holding people down, I certainly know from the research that very few people self-identify as wicked, right? And we know from the strategies that telling someone that you think is wicked that they're wicked is unlikely to make them less wicked, right? And it's likely to divide us even more and undermine the ability to communicate. So within this deliberative perspective, there's also this pragmatic notion that the best way for us to move forward is to change, how we talk about it, right? Another way of thinking about this is if a lot of our problems are truly caused by powerful people behind the scenes holding us back, I think they love the fact that we're all screaming at each other and that facts don't matter, right? And it's all just kind of this past each other. So as we start elevating our conversations, as we start learning how to engage each other again, all of a sudden, if there's people behind the scenes, that will be more evident. Right? The second shift is from this adversarial perspective to a much more collaborative one. And this, again, pulls from the social psychology, because when we're in adversarial mode, our brain isn't working and the worst parts of human nature get lit up. When we're in collaborative mode, all of a sudden we're tapping in to other parts of the brain, which are admittedly harder to reach, but possible, certainly with good process and a good kind of culture in a local community. So going back to the research, some of the positives that I found from the research that we actively try to design to get into these. And these particularly have high potential at a local level when real people are coming together to talk to each other and they have an inherent sense of place and connection in a community. So how do we design, how do we engage tough issues that bring these out rather than the last one is the heart of a lot of the deliberative work that we're doing. And the last point here, while the negative is easier to trigger, it's more powerful. The reality is brains can develop and habits can kind of form. So how do we at a local level start that process of really building it? And we know from the research, which is exciting, that the more you engage people in this way, the more you change these conversations, the easier it is to do, because people start seeing the world through these lenses. Right? And then the last thing, particularly for those who we heard a lot in the fall as we engaged people about what kind of journalism you want. One of the biggest themes was we want accuracy, we want facts, we want to just give us the information, kind of a traditional role of journalism in a sense. While this is the 4th shift, that when we shift from the adversarial model, bringing out the worst in us, to the more collaborative model, in the adversarial model, facts don't work the way we should, right? They work as ammunition that you throw or fake news that you dismiss. Whereas when we're in the collaborative mode, we actually want good information to help us solve those problems, right? So if you're someone who really kind of cares about data when it gets back to the fact, we need to change how we talk about issues before facts can work the way that we want them to. Right? So the last point of the components here are these notions of, these are some of the things, particularly when we're running meetings. And the CBD for the first 5 years was really event focused. Our whole bread and butter was running these meetings, people coming together. You see the picture on the bottom with my students at every table, kind of help people have these conversations. But as we kept on growing, we realized, well, only a certain amount of people can come to our meetings. How do we work more broadly in the local community to kind of have this, right? And this is one of the things that led us today, is how do we connect with newspapers and radio and the libraries to kind of build more of a deliberative culture, not just at our meetings, but outside, right? So translating some of these concepts that were initially developed at a meeting to a broader context is kind of what we're working on. But how do we frame the issue? When do we engage people? How do we think about who's responsible to take on the issue? And the second point is probably the one I'm probably most excited about moving forward. For CPD events, and you'll see an example of this later in the week if you participate in some of our small group discussions we have scheduled on reimagining local journalism. I'll give you a highlight at the very end today. We spend all that time making sense of the noise and hearing everyone from different perspectives, filtering that, checking some things, and then we create these discussion guides that we report out what we heard to people, framed specifically for deliberation. In a document that's designed to spark conversation versus a document designed for persuasion, or even a document designed just for informing, just to give people basic facts. There's a different art to that, that we're really going to be exploring. How do we bring that to journalism in some interesting ways? Of how do we report out what we heard? Pretty easy to gather lots of opinions. Making sense of those opinions and framing them in a way that helps the community move forward is what we're really going to try to learn how to do well together. Right. And those last three bullet points are more kind of specific to meetings, but I do want to point out, and I should give out a call out to the book News for Us. Paula Ellis, and I think one of the co-authors is on the call, folks from Boulder as well. That's another book that really launched this. Paula has been doing a lot of work with the Kettering Foundation. I've known her for years. Her brand new book, I think that Ashley will link to the book there, so y'all kind of get it. Part of where it talks about is the journalist as facilitator, right? And how do we really kind of build up that particular kind of identity and persona of a journalist, right? So for 20 years, I've been training facilitators for small group events. Applying that knowledge more broadly is going to be exciting. So then I'm going to do this really quick, and then the last 6 points we'll maybe dive into a little bit later. So this is the Canner model, which is one last thing I just want to share that helps you think about the kind of conversations that we need to have when we're working on tough issues with broad audiences. And you can see it's kind of divided up into 3 different stages. Each stage requires a different way of talking, requires a different capacity, a different conversation in a sense. So initially we need divergent thinking. This is where open-mindedness is important. This is where we're brainstorming. We don't want to be judgmental. We want to reach out to as many kind of audiences as possible and hear from everybody, right? And we want to get beyond the usual suspects, so how do we do all that to open up the conversation and hear from everybody? The problem is if you do that well, it gets messy because now you have lots of different voices and lots of different perspectives. So the heart of the deliberative work is this working through the groan zone. And this for me often requires small groups, people talking to each other, struggling, understanding each other, interacting, asking each other questions. One at a time in a microphone doesn't do that. A survey doesn't do that, right? Letters to the editor doesn't tend to do that, in a traditional kind of form, right? So this is where we'll be experiencing, it's really easy with the internet now to do that first stage of gathering lots of opinions. How do we help people work through those opinions and develop mutual understanding and hopefully some respect of opposing opinions? But then we still have that third point, which is a whole different conversation. Because we can get stuck in the middle. We can get stuck in this groan zone and focus on understanding, but never move to action. And deliberation at the heart of it is talk about what we should do, right? It's what should we do now? So the conversion thinking, we have to start making some tough choices. We have to prioritize. We have to kind of see what's worked in other places. This is where, excited about partnering with solutions journalism that we'll hear a little bit about, right? So how do we kind of move to action and not talk forever? So a lot of my work now is looking at these 3 stages and then looking at a community. What kind of resources does a community have for each stage? And then how can we intervene to kind of build that, right? One of the exciting things that you'll hear about from Eric in particular is, the Coloradan just relaunched its editorial page, its opinion page, right? With help from us, and we'll be kind of, experimenting to how to make that not just something about divergent thinking and a chance for people to express themselves, but for a place for more interaction. They're calling it Coloradan Conversations, right? And we're now tapping into other newsrooms that hopefully kind of help that we have this local resource focused just on local issues that really help us talk through the issues in important ways, and eventually help the community on the back end that we move forward towards action. Right? So the last thing, I'm just going to put this up. and maybe leave it up for a second. But this is, we introduced these all last fall. But these are the 6 kind of key tasks initially that we thought that we want to focus on with the Deliberative Journalism Project. And you'll see in a way that they kind of match the Kaner grown zone, right? How do we make sure broad voices are represented in the beginning? How do we improve the quality and access to information so everyone's hearing these things? The transition from divergent thinking to grown zone is, how do we summarize? How do we, frame issues in productive ways that help us engage? The engaging authentically is, this is where the CPD can certainly kind of step in and help of actually having conversations and interaction, talking to each other. And on the back end, how do we actually, help work together to be a catalyst for collaborative action? And then the last point is what we're doing tonight. The first 5 reflect for specific topics that we'll be kind of engaging. And then we'll also be doing quite a few of these webinars and discussions of just building capacity of how do we learn from each other to do these 5 tasks better as we're going through, right? So the point of tonight, is to refine this idea of deliberative journalism and kind of think about how these ideas kind of play off. We have a work group that's going to be meeting monthly to kind of keep this conversation going and kind of bring these worlds together, because the best innovation comes when 2 separate worlds that always overlapped become more proactive in kind of how they work together. So with that, I'm going to move things around so I can get to my stop share. Let's switch now to the gallery views. Yeah, I can kind of see everybody here. So now I'm going to introduce my panel. And I think what we'll do here is we'll introduce one of y'all one at a time, and then let y'all kind of do just some initial top of mind thoughts about what you think about what I, both the ideas I laid out, but also more broadly in terms of those, the 2 crises that we're dealing with, right? How do you see in your work? I know y'all all kind of inherently are going to deal with both of these, right? So we'll hear from each of y'all kind of initially. Let me get my bios here. So we're going to start with Laura Frank. I got her bio here. She's the executive director of CoLab, the Colorado News Collaborative. It's a nonprofit working with more than 160 news outlets and their communities across Colorado to make democracy stronger by making our local journalism stronger. Laura pioneered collaborative journalism in Colorado as the founder of iNews, the nonprofit investigative news organization that merged with Rocky Mountain Public Media in 2013, the first such merger in the nation. Laura is a Denver native who spent 20 years reporting for newspapers, radio, and public television around the country, specializing in investigative reporting and data analysis. She's a founding member and former chair of the Institute for Nonprofit News. Her work has won awards in both broadcast and print and led to changes in laws and lines. Right? So, Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martine, and thank you for that presentation. There's so much to dig into tonight. So I appreciate you inviting me. I also appreciate the other members of the panel because this is a great mix. So as you described, CoLab is a coalition of more than 160 news outlets across the state, plus the communities that they serve. And that means the largest newsrooms, like the Denver Post or Colorado Public Radio or the large television stations like 9 News. It means the smallest newsrooms across the state, mom and pop shops, weekly newspapers, digital startups. It means media who serve communities of color or rural communities. It's all of those on every platform that you can imagine. And so one of the things that we really try to do through CoLab, because we know that you can have the best journalism in the world. If people are not engaging with it, if they don't trust it, if they don't take it and use the information, and that is why a free press is protected in the First Amendment of the US Constitution. The founders of this country understood you can't have a democracy without reliable factual information, because you need, democracy needs the deliberation, right? So you need information in order to deliberate. So what what we have determined, like you, is key to helping to strengthen democracy is that interaction between the media and the public. And so I'm just thrilled to be here tonight to help think about how we can strengthen that interaction. And I'll stop there because I know you want to introduce everybody else, but I'm eager to get into this conversation.
One quick question I'll ask you just kind of based on that, right? Because that's one thing that I certainly learned from the fall, and you'll see this in the discussion guide we're developing that I'll briefly show at the end today. But yeah, it's both a supply and a demand problem, right? That we can't just all of a sudden like, oh, let's all work together to create a supply of quality journalism. If people don't want quality journal, I think people say they want it, right? But again, because of human nature, we're going to be drawn to the journalism that tells us we want to hear, right? So part of this project too, and I think the civic capacity task gets to this, is we need to work on the community, to build a demand for it, while we're also helping the local newsrooms actually be able to provide the supply. I think it's both sides there, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, we will now go to Emma's next on my list, right? So Emma Athena is a freelance writer who also serves as a senior editor for Boulder Weekly. Over the years, her work investigating the intersection of people, the places they inhabit, and the public policies that shape how humans interact has been featured in numerous local, regional, and national publications. She's also a Solutions Journalism Network graduate, so she'll tell us a little about that, and a grant recipient, and the host of the podcast Unhoused, a 6-part series exploring different solutions to homelessness in Boulder. She's working on her first book entitled Sola, an account of her 7-month solo adventure in South America, a journey through new landscapes, changing minds, people, and souls. Emma, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Thanks so much, Martine. Hola a todos, me llamo Emma y soy periodista. Estoy llamando desde...
Hello, everyone. My name is Emma, and I'm a journalist. I'm here in my office in Boulder. I am very excited to be here tonight with all of you.
And I have been a part of the Solutions Journalism Network since 2017. So almost coming up on 5 years now. And the Solutions Journalism Network is a global program that now includes over 500 newsrooms and I think over 20,000 journalists who are all committed to incorporating solutions journalism into their reporting. So the Solutions Journalism Network is essentially a framing tool. And so this idea of solutions journalism, it's a type of reporting that expands the definition of news beyond just what's gone wrong. So we all know that a lot of journalism focuses on defining and explaining the problems in a community. And beyond the potential for that sort of distorting the reality, if all news coverage is bad, one might tend to think that everything in the world is bad. As a reader, as a consumer of news, that can be really depressing sometimes to just be in that cycle of bad news, bad news, bad news, problems, problems, problems. So the solutions journalism angle comes in when a problem is already well known in a community. And it takes the same investigative rigor and criticism and just really focused thought that we bring to all of our news stories and applies it very specifically to investigating and explaining how people are trying to solve these widely shared problems. So, and that's because responses to problems are also newsworthy, right? When we add rigorous coverage of solutions, journalists, 1, can tell a much more complete picture of a situation, and 2, it often inspires new dialogue or ideas about how to address and solve shared issues. And so the Solutions Journalism Network hosts trainings. That's how I first got involved with them. They sent a member to Boulder Weekly's office, and all of us in the office received a couple hours of training on how to bring this lens to our reporting. And so we're through this, intending to complement and strengthen the coverage of problems while also equipping people in all communities with the knowledge to envision and build a more equitable and sustainable world. And so I find this lens particularly helpful when I'm reporting about a shared community problem that is a chronic one. So we can think of things like climate change, homelessness, mental health issues, right? These are all known problems and they've been around for a long time. And so I'll bring up the example of my podcast, Unhoused. Here in Boulder, homelessness is not a new issue, and it's not an issue unique to Boulder by any means. But in 2020, we saw a spike or a spike in the visibility of homelessness that drove a lot of the tensions that Martine talked about earlier. And so through the solutions journalism lens, I was able to look at homelessness through a solutions angle. And I decided to kind of take multiple different facets of our community's homelessness problem. And through individuals' articles, I looked at the different solutions that exist, not only in Boulder, but I think more importantly and more interestingly, in other communities around the nation. So not only sparked, community dialogue here in Boulder, but it also brought in voices from across the state of Colorado and largely across the United States, because homelessness is an issue, as I mentioned before, we all share, and we all, different communities have tried different things. And I found it a particularly effective way to get creative with a known and established problem. That also makes me think of just the medium of delivery of news. So with this Unhoused series, produced a 6-part written article, and I decided to supplement that with a 6-part podcast because I sound adds this wonderful dimensionality to storytelling. And when we think about audience engagement, not everyone learns or engages best with written products. And I wanted to invite community members in that might have a more, might lean towards auditory learning and maybe, introducing information in new ways to people can kind of inspire them to think about a problem in new light or differently. So research from the Solutions Journalism Network actually backs up a lot of the brain science that you, Martine, showed us a couple slides ago. And it shows that audiences across all demographics actually find solution stories more interesting, trustworthy, and informative, and can change their understanding of issues in a way that makes them more enthusiastic about participating in civic life. So I've got many more examples of solutions projects I've worked on. I'm sure we'll get into those later, but in some, I think, when it's done well, solution stories really provide valuable insights that help communities with the very difficult and real work of tackling problems. So thanks so much for inviting me to this panel, and I'm really excited.
One quick thing I'll respond to is, going back to the social psychology, one of the terms that I learned about was negativity bias, right? Our brains are kind of wired to be tuned into negative more, right? Danger is much more important than opportunity, just naturally. And you can kind of understand, evolutionally why kind of that focus is. But that's part of the kind of the reality is, solutions journalism is not typical, right? Because just telling kind of the conflict and the devil figures and the bad news and blaming people naturally gravitate towards that, right? So that gets back to the supply and demand, right? That we need the solutions journalism, but then how do we actually build the demand for it, that people see it? And the good news, and certainly the work that we've been doing, right, while we in our meetings, while we get people to work, brains to work differently, once they're exposed to something different, to an authentic engagement, right? Once they're exposed to better journalism, I think they see the value of it. And that's where we see the positive feedback loop kind of growing in the more and more. So it's been exciting to see how fast solutions journalism has grown, and I'm excited about kind of making those connections. The other quick thing is this interesting notion that when we're in adversarial mode, we focus on blame. Mm-hmm. When we're in collaborative mode, we focus on working together. Deliberation is all about answering the question, what should we do about this, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there's going to be some fun connections there. Right. All right, now Eric will join us. So Eric is the executive editor of the Fort Collins Coloradan and the Colorado State editor for the USA Today Network. during his time as editor, Coloradan has won multiple Colorado Press Association Innovation Awards. And I can say, at least working closely with him for the last 6 months here, he's open to innovation, open to new ideas. So we certainly appreciate that. I think some more awards will be coming the Coloradans' way. He was a recipient of the 2019 News Media Alliance John P. Murray Award for Excellence in Audience Development, and has more than doubled the Coloradans' number of digital subscriber in his short time here. Was it 3 years now, or how long have you been editor? So Eric, take us away.
Yeah, well, thanks, Martine. And, I mean, thanks to you first for being the catalyst of bringing us all together here. I got involved in this effort out of some conversations that Martine and I had long ago when the Coloradoan had much more resources, and we were looking to really change how we tackled the opinion page, which I had become extremely dissatisfied with for a lot of the reasons that we defined as our key tasks in here. As traditional news media, and that's what I am. I've been almost 20 years in corporate media through Lee and Gannett, and I watched as our staff shrunk, our ability to really curate and develop opinion journalism that was meaningful started to become the provenance of the largest papers that still had the resources. And small to mid-sized papers like ours, which were frankly struggling to get people to the boards and commissions that we feel we need to cover to first report on the news, so then we can have informed opinions to layer on top of that. It became, opinion journalism became as other duties as assigned to someone who was there. I realized I just wasn't doing a very good job of it. I'm a trained reporter. I'm not necessarily a trained columnist, but as I took hold of the opinion page for the first time and ran a community editorial board, I realized we weren't engaging broad voices, which is one of the key tasks. We weren't accessible. If you looked at who was providing opinions, it typically were people who had a public title next to their name, or they had a PR firm behind them that could help them craft a message, or they were highly educated English speakers with time to write a 600-word essay on their feelings. And not all of us communicate that way. We also didn't summarize what we were learning. We presented it and moved on to the next thing, because that's what we're really good at as daily journalists, is trying to find something new the next day to write about. And we were always rewarded in our traditional models for doing so, right? It was what story can get the most views, which can sell the most ads, which can continue to keep us in our jobs. And with the collapse of the traditional ad model, a lot of those underlying themes that led us to think that way had to be rethought, right? And so yes, I'm the editor who killed the opinion page, but through the conversations I've had with Martine and hearing about really the cool and exciting ways that the CPD was bringing people together, I thought there's got to be a way that we can participate in that. And so Martine brought us to the place where we were able to get the American Press Institute grant, and they've been a great partner in that. And it came at the right time when, for those of us in quote unquote corporate media, traditional media, for the longest time, we didn't think about grant funding. That was just a thing that other people did, right? And we've become, we've changed our thinking in that as resources have become more scarce. Really, you see what, the great work that Laura and CoLab have done in bringing people together, not, who were once, not that long ago, defined as fierce competitors, right? We were fighting for ad dollars, we were fighting for scoops, and, you saw just all of that change. And so we went from this place of deep dissatisfaction with presenting an opinion page or 2 opinion pages that maybe had maybe 6, maybe 10 voices in them. And, I realized that those voices started to become homogenous. The conversation became kind of a ping pong. Point made this week, counterpoint made this week. Maybe we get another counterpoint the next week. Meanwhile, the rest of the world has moved on with their conversation, about this. And we weren't, working at the speed of news, frankly, that the amount of information, that the internet and the current ecosystem, allows people to get to. So, we're very much in this, this beginning phase of defining what, deliberative journalism looks like at the Colorado. And I don't know if you can hear behind me, but I've got 3 young children who are, I don't know, we lost our screaming and trying to get to bed. But, the driving factor behind this for me is coming from a place where I understand that doing things the same way won't preserve journalism for them, and trying to be a bridge to some sort of future where deliberation, quality information are really key and preserved for them when they come of age, like it was for me. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll want to dig into some of those themes, right? And I'd love to hear Laura in a little bit particular, but others, talk about, some of the innovations coming up about financial, figure out different ways, right? One thing that we'll engage certainly in the discussions later this week is this idea of looking at local journalism as a public good, and your lab has written some good resources on this in a sense of how do we rethink that we can't just leave it up to the market, right? Because of all these different factors that we talked about, local news, so we have to see it as something that the community kind of supports and then get really creative on different ways we can support that, right? All right, so now I'm going to introduce Michael Humphrey. So he's an assistant professor here at CSU in the Journalism and Media Communication Department. He researches how life stories and broader narratives emerge on social media platforms and teaches digital storytelling, ethics, and analytics. In the fall, we're really excited. He's going to be teaching an advanced reporting class that will be focused on supporting this broader project and kind of experimenting and providing some boots on the ground to help do some of these things that we're wanting to do. Before CSU, Mike was a newspaper and magazine reporter and editor. He began his career as a community journalist in rural Missouri and Illinois, and later became a feature writer for the Kansas City Star, the National Catholic Reporter, and Forbes. So, Mike.
Well, thanks, Martine, for doing this and putting this together. It's great to hear from Laura, Emma, and Eric. I feel like a lot of what I do these days is supporting exactly all of the efforts that the 3 of you have talked about, and by teaching students how to think about being not just reporters and editors and storytellers in that classic sense, but also to be part of a community and a prospering community. And I think the way we've been thinking about these over the past couple of years is to look very clearly at what's happened to the media industry. When I first entered it as a newspaper reporter in the early 1990s, I had a little bit of dread every time I went to the supermarket, wherever I was either a reporter or an editor, because there was always a chance that you'd get stopped and have a 20-minute conversation with somebody who usually disagreed with something you had done recently. And but now I miss those days, because as I moved to larger media and started to feel that disconnection between what I did in the newsroom and the community around me, because that community might be anywhere, I started to experience exactly what I think has happened to the media industry in general, which is a disconnection between our identities and our sense of belonging and the media that we consume, or a recapitulation of what those identities and sense of belonging mean, to the point where I think local journalism is one of the last chances we have of rebuilding this, because connecting to where you live and your neighborhoods and your neighbors and the places that you go that are important to you is one of those chances to say there's something that we belong to that has nothing to do necessarily with our ideologies and nothing to do with our opinions about specific topics, but has to do with the fact that we have all agreed to live here and together. And that's something I've been really interested in teaching students to think about through multiple means. Some of them make sense. Digital storytelling is a lot like what Emma was talking about, using different platforms to tell different parts of the story that make sense for that platform. So how does sound enrich a sense of connection? How does social media make you feel like you can speak back and forth? What does print do? What does video do? But also by looking at audiences, by studying them, the way traditional marketing has studied audiences. So I teach a class that teaches that, how teaches journalists how to think about their audiences. Who are they? What do they want? Where can you find them? And then ask questions, both quantitative and qualitative questions, to bring them into better understanding for the journalist. I also teach an analytics class, a digital media analytics class, so that we look at, once somebody is on a site, what are they looking for? How are they wayfinding their way through the information? What are they engaging with? And what are our expectations of what an audience is doing versus the reality of what an audience is doing? Because we might write a 2,000-word story and expect somebody to read every single word on that. And when you look at the analytics and see people are spending 4 minutes on it, it's very unlikely that's happened. So why? And so it's a far more rounded sense of being a journalist than I had when I was learning to be a journalist in my 20s. That also means just a tremendous amount more pressure on what the reporter has to face. So how do we prioritize what we need to do with the work that we can do for the community becomes a really important question. And I feel like we're in a good place here. I feel like there's some good news, because when I first showed up, and I think Eric can confirm this, that a lot of those questions were really about what I call vanity analytics, just getting as big a number as possible and calling that engagement. We've moved from that to what's real engagement, dialogues with the community. And we've started to realize that the value that we are representing through our work is not necessarily a value in those large numbers, but a sense of returning, a sense of belonging, a sense of speaking within those platforms, and then to subscribe or to donate or to do the kinds of things that say, I do value you and I do feel like I belong here. I think that's the future of the way we're going to think about building media, and that means understanding the identities we're working with. And I think, Martine, you probably have questions about this, so I'll talk about where the concept of narrative and story, that sort of other cap I wear, the research cap, comes in. But from a journalism point of view, one of the things I always say in my classes at the end of the day is we are trying to build community through this content. And if we're not doing that, we're probably failing, because attention, which is where a lot of the concepts around attention economy are interesting, but attention is only the first step. Beyond attention are all these other steps that you take to feel like what you are consuming from the media is trustable, important, usable, all the things that the other panelists were talking about. So that's what we're trying to teach in our department.
Yeah, no, I love that note about the importance of building community, because I think that's something local journalism can do in a very different way, right? That a lot of journalism is tapping into particular identities or groups that bring like-minded people together, but often do that by pushing back on them, or tapping into some of those kind of problematic kind of natures. So, but a local journalism can really kind of build off a sense of place and start with much more of a common ground, which is something, my work's primarily on the democracy side, right? I'm trying to figure out how do we protect and revive democracy, and then seeing journalism as a means to that end, and see how that kind of links together in some exciting ways, right? So yeah, so one thing I want to talk a little bit more about, well, I guess two things, and we can see what people want to kind of jump in first, and then also y'all are welcome to ask each other questions. And then we do have the Q&A function, so people that are watching, feel free to kind of throw some questions out at us. So one, and maybe starting with Laura, but others can kind of jump in, is thinking about these new financial models and these new ways of thinking about how do we fund local journalism. And part of that is, both at the national level and at the state level, we've actually have some legislation kind of being proposed at this point of providing some resources. So I don't know if you can tell us a little bit about that and what you think about that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'll start at the state level. There's a bill in the state legislature right now that would help small businesses in Colorado get the word out to the public about their businesses, and at the same time help support local news media. So the idea is that there's a $2,500 amount available to small businesses if they use it to purchase ads on local media. And that can be any platform. It could be newspaper, digital, broadcast. And the idea is it's a win-win for folks to have to get that information, to help businesses come out of the pandemic, to help local media make that case that they are connectors in the community. I work with a lot of publishers and other news managers around the state, and especially I would say the local newspapers, the weekly and daily newspapers around the state. Many of the publishers of those entities see a big part of their role in community to let folks know what is happening economically and business-wise in their communities. So in many ways, those ads are important to the not only to support the production of news, but to let the community know what's happening with businesses when there are new products, when there are sales, when there are changes in ownership, all of those kinds of things. But it's so that is in the Colorado state legislature. On the federal level, there's a bill that was part of the Build Back Better, which is, I think terminally stalled, but it's now called the Local News Payroll Tax Credit. So any news outlet that is a local news out covering local community news and employing at least one full-time journalist covering local news would be eligible for a payroll tax credit of up to $25,000 for the first 2 years of the program, and then $15,000 for the next 3 years after that, years 3, 4, and 5 of the program. And I can tell you, working with the news outlets that CoLab does across the state, this would have a huge impact in their ability to produce news. The Rebuild Local News Coalition, which is a national coalition, did an analysis of every state. And for Colorado, they estimated that about 150 news outlets in Colorado would be eligible for this. And it would probably mean over the 5 years, about $51 million into Colorado's economy through the program. So it could have really huge impact. And there is some bipartisan support for that at this point. So there's some great hope that this might actually move forward. So one of the things that CoLab is preparing to do is help news outlets take advantage of and be ready for that kind of work. Because one of the things that, of course, probably everyone listening to this is doing the math in their head. Okay, well, let's say that $25,000 may pay for half of the salary of a news reporter. And, if half of your news staff salary is covered for 2 years, and then maybe a third of it is covered for 3 years after that, what are news organizations going to do in that 5-year runway to make sure that they can maintain that level of employment afterwards? So we're really trying to think about, how do you prepare to be positioned to replace that money, because that's always the concern when you are getting some kind of subsidy from the government. But the idea is that would have a firewall between the government and the media, because you don't want government control over media. I think we all see in Russia right now what happens. Not that our government is the same as the Russian government, but it's just not a good practice. There are reasons that there's a division between those two entities. But those are the two big things right now, Martine, that are on the table locally and nationally.
Others want to respond to that or add anything to that, to the idea of legislation, or?
Well,
I'll just say it's taken a long time to get here. I'm sure Laura can agree with that. That we as an industry spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to adjust to this gigantic disruption that was dealt to us more than 20 years ago. The idea that it's a public good, I think, is a really good start. But it's also important for us to remember that the public good that we promise at times competes with the fact we also have to produce a product. And sometimes it's better to be slower, but it's really hard to be slower when you're producing the news. So I think convincing people of that good is still the big goal here. And some of that is about practice, but a lot of that's about communicating it. Sorry, Laura, I didn't mean to step up.
No, I was just going to say, while people are thinking about what I'm going to put a pitch in for this book that I've been reading. It's Martha Minow, Saving the News. And she actually makes the case that the US Constitution, which I'll note this is the second time I've mentioned the Constitution already tonight, the Constitution actually calls for government action to preserve freedom of speech. And of course, freedom of press is one of the big aspects of that. And I will go on the record, because if you Google around, you can probably find video of me being very much against government support of media. But I do think in these times, we've been able to figure out some ways to have that, like I said, that firewall, so that you don't wind up having a media that is beholden in any way, which is why I'm so concerned about how media come out of that subsidy, if you want to look at it that way.
Have we seen either individual cities or states in the United States pass some of this legislation yet? Or
Yeah, New York actually had a state law. It was originally I believe, I hope I get this right, enacted by the governor, and now they're going back and putting it into law, where there was some kind of subsidy for businesses. Actually, it was governments, when governments do a lot of advertising, legal ads, and this is a huge source of revenue for local media, including in Colorado, when governments have to alert the public of some alert that's required legally, like taxes or whatever it is. They have to put that in a general circulation media outlet. And in New York, they said, all right, government, instead of putting our tax dollars into Facebook or other ads that are not helping the local economy, you need to put a certain portion of that into local media, who are not only helping the local economy, but also reaching audiences, reaching communities that those other outlets may not reach. So, for example, media who are serving communities of color or rural communities or particular communities that aren't using some of those other outlets, who aren't reading the New York Times or whatever it was. So that actually, the Colorado legislation used the New York legislation as a jumping off point, as a starting point.
I wanted to speak about funding from a freelance perspective. In funding for journalism throughout the industry, obviously not a new issue. but the pandemic, as a freelancer, the pandemic definitely did exacerbate some of the funding issues I was encountering as I would pitch stories and projects to publications. Around 2020, I kept getting feedback that, oh, we just don't have the budget to produce that. We don't have the budget now. We'll wait, circle back with us in 6 months. And so it really made me stop and pause and try to figure out where I could get funding as a local journalist to sustain myself, and my living expenses, but also like stay a contributing member to my community through my journalism. And I turned to grants at that point. I'd never really worked on grants beforehand, but the Solutions Journalism Network kind of inspired me to look elsewhere for more grants too. So I'm really curious moving forward to see how the grant landscape for independent freelance journalists to help newsrooms that have had staff cuts or budget cuts, keep the content at a high quality and coming, on a weekly, daily, monthly basis. So I think there's, some symbiosis there where these independent organizations can supplement local news coverage in a really robust way that is serving everyone.
And I'll try to find this source and post it here in a second, but I know I've read a whole bunch the last 6 months trying to get my head around these connections. And I know just from a philanthropic perspective, right, the notion, and in some ways you might get grants like an organization that cares about homelessness that might give a grant to some from really high quality investigative journalism on homelessness. But you're also seeing journalism itself now being supported on its own, right? That people just realize that this is a cause that we should focus on. And one argument that I've been making in the last 10 years, in a sense, is I truly believe our inability to talk to each other, I think, is our number one issue, right? Because if we can't talk to each other and we just assume the worst of each other and facts don't matter, we're not going to be able to move the needle on any issue we care about, right? So my goal or my focus is, okay, how do we build capacity in our ability to engage each other and talk to each other and have conversations, with the assumption that if we build that capacity, it could have a positive impact on lots of different issues. And I think you're seeing philanthropy kind of think about that now, of saying, whether this is local community foundations of saying no, journalism has to be kind of supported, or a lot of national foundations. So, we're working to kind of tap into that and kind of build on that, of just realizing that might be one of the sources to help us, build back the journalism that we've lost and take on some of these challenges.
Too, kind of in the reverse way, at Boulder Weekly, we've done 2 GoFundMe campaigns in the last year to raise money for records requests that, as a small business, our newspaper wasn't able to fund. And so I think that was, a way to open up the process to the community and invite people into, supporting these records requests financially, but it creates this investment in the community of like, oh, I actually want to see the reporting that results from these documents. We want to talk about this. So I think it's been interesting to see that kind of go both ways.
So one thing I want, maybe Mike could talk about this a little bit more, but then if others kind of have ideas, right? So part of what we're exploring here is the particular collaboration between local newsrooms and the university, right? Part of this is the CPD model, right? So the way my model works is, primarily undergraduate students are taking coursework to be trained as facilitators. So they're learning that what I see is a very useful skill set of the world and getting class credit, while they're also providing capacity for their community to help us run these events and kind of going through it, right? So we're hoping through some of Mike's efforts and other efforts, and we're doing it this semester in another class, because particularly if you look back at some of those key tasks, right, of wanting to really reach out to all audiences, right? And for some of those that takes a lot more work. You're having to build that network. You're having to kind of reach out. You're having to build relationships. You're having to connect with organizations. But then also, there's so much information, the information kind of overload, right? So filtering information, fact checking, all that is highly labor intensive at a time that we know most newsrooms are cutting, right? So we're going to be exploring about, how might we be able to use students to be a resource for that, right? So Mike, I don't know if you can talk a little bit more about what you're thinking for the fall, but also maybe the other panelists. And this is another, it's not a magic bullet, right? So how might you think we can, tap into the next generation of journalists and help us kind of, create some win-wins here?
Kind of interesting because in some ways there is a little bit of a divide here as well. The way industry and academia talk to each other can get pretty rancorous at times and accusatory. So I think the way to solve that is collaboration here as well. One of the ways we're thinking about it this semester is just to introduce students to the idea of deliberation. It's certainly not something you learn in J school, naturally. So learning what the concepts are, and that's basically asking Martine to spend extra time in some of our classrooms talking about this. But the other thing we really want to try next semester when we do an advanced reporting class is to invite a lot more students to the class than just reporters. We are going to invite advertising students and social media management students, public relations students, and even political science and communication studies students are welcome as Spanish majors as well. People who don't necessarily think of themselves as journalists, but can be part of this wave that I've been reading lately of the need for all hands on deck to sort of build up rebuild our democratic institutions, and so I think that belongs to a lot more than just students who are learning how to report the news. And I think that will be really exciting because all those skills are really helpful in making sure that we're reaching as far and as deep as possible into the community, which is one of the problems. The model that's working right now, and some of what Laura talked about will help with this, is a subscription model. And of course, that's a model of rebuilding walls away from audiences that may never see the information in the paper. So we are going to spend a lot of time working on that. Like, how do we get into the community in ways that maybe traditional media hasn't in the past, or has ignored it, or even worse, has done damage to in the past. And all those things are a fact. So that, I think, is going to be one of our big explorations. That very first part of Martine's first step is making sure we're broadening the voices that are heard in this conversation.
I would just like to say, I think we all should be commending CSU for being on the cutting edge of this kind of work with students, because it is challenging, let me say, to be in a newsroom and keep up with all the changes within the industry. So to be in academia, one step removed from that, and not only trying to keep up with all the changes in the industry, but then prepare students to be ready to meet those changes when they graduate. You need a crystal ball and all kinds of other things that probably don't exist. So I commend you, Michael and Martine, and the whole team for what you're doing. On the issue of community engagement, my very strong belief is based on something that, let's see, I'm going to butcher. Anyway, that one of the founding founders of the country talked a lot about when people have the right information, they're able to make the right decisions. So that really guides my belief in the idea that when the news is relevant and people can access it, they will want to support it. And Michael just mentioned, a subscription model. Maybe many of you watching or listening to this right now may know that for years, decades, and centuries, news media in the United States relied mostly on advertisement to pay for the production of news. And really that, the advertising model has collapsed because of digital advertising and so on. But the subscription model is really making a comeback. And there's kind of a sweet spot. I spent 7 years in public media, and the way that public media does news is membership, individual small donations, because you're not beholden to an advertiser, you're not beholden to a government, you're not beholden to a large donor or a foundation. You have a number of individuals who are getting value, who believe that news is a public good. And that in and of itself is a reason for them to support the production and dissemination of news. And that, all of those other things I just mentioned need to be part of the revenue pie. But having individual people who recognize the value of factual news is essential to the whole system. And I just want to say, Anna Claire asked a question in the chat a moment ago saying, do you think grant funding and legislation, do you think it would be possible for state funding, for example, to channel into local media? Well, in the ways that I just described, Anna Claire, yes, state funding can channel and federal funding can channel into it, but I think we have to be extraordinarily careful how that happens. I mentioned public media. There are a number of states where the state government has a line item in the budget for public media, for its public radio or public television. And I know from the 7 years that I spent in public media, this is a real source of angst because it's disappearing. It gets cut every year. Colorado as a state does not put any direct funding into media. But that's why I think it's so fantastic the way that Colorado is approaching this, because it'll be the small businesses who vote with their ad purchases on which media they think are most trusted and connected to community. So it takes the government out of the business of trying to decide who deserves it and who doesn't. It's people voting with their dollars.
So open up space here a little bit. I don't know if any of y'all have questions for each other or questions, going back to concepts from the presentation that y'all want to dig into, or.
Oh, Don saved me in the chat. It was Thomas Jefferson. I suddenly went blank. Was it George Washington? No, it was after that. Thomas Jefferson. A well-informed citizenry can be trusted with their own government. Yeah. So anyway, yeah.
One of the things, and I know Eric, you about.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that really struck me from Michael's perspective too was, and it went back to something that Emma mentioned as a freelancer is there's a wide opportunity gulf for non-full-time journalists right now, right? So if you're someone like me and you at least have some tenuous stability of your ability to continue to do your job. But as a freelancer, what freelancers have seen is that opportunity to just dry up and dry up and dry up, as people like me have said, well, that traditional ad model collapsed. We have less money to work with. What am I going to cut when I know, it's people, we need people to do journalism. We need reporters to do journalism. So we cut on those sides. And what has happened is it reduces the number of voices in your product, right? Because the community columnists that we once had, or the freelancers, or the internships that we had, those are the things that when you're looking across the way and you say, well, I can keep this person full time, or I can have that intern. Those are the very hard choices that we've made over the past, ever since I've been a journalist, or at least in a leadership position. But it's, but I think it's really imperative for opportunities to offer opportunities like this to young journalists, to, even if we can't give them that internship, to be involved in the process, to be part of a community of fostering these discussions. And that's, like Michael said, in the past, academia and the practitioners of the world have kind of had that, oh, well, they don't do it right. And well, they certainly don't do it right. But, again, this rising tide of collaboration, I think if we can capitalize on anything out of this, for the sake of local journalism, it's that, and breaking down those very traditional walls of, we pay you to write a freelance article, we pay you to have an internship. No, all are invited, all can be a part of this in some way that shows too, for a hiring manager down the line, it's not that you have the degree, it's what you've done with it. And to have that opportunity for more young journalists to say, look at what I've done to help foster these discussions, to provide, information to the community that I serve, whether that's for 2 years at a community college, 4 years at college, longer for grad work and into there. But I mean, that really does help, provide a future of trained, journalists who are dedicated to having those conversations, which, isn't something that all of us came naturally to.
A lot of head nodding from Michael and Emma there. Y'all want to jump in and talk a little bit more about that, or?
Emma, please.
Yeah, I would just echo what Eric said about how, in a meta sense, having a really diverse freelancer pool and paying them adequately for their work, for their editing, for their photos, for everything that's involved in getting, a project or an article from start to finish. That, brings different types of collaboration into the newsroom as well. Different editors working with each other, with different freelancers. And I think, that ultimately leads to more engaged and diverse readerships as freelancers bring different sources, different perspectives, different life experiences to the table that, imbue the newsroom with different types of collaboration, and that extends throughout the readership. So.
Well, one of y'all would respond to this concern. I know I had one conversation last year, as particularly no one on this call, that where I was talking about potentially using students and those type of things, and got some pushback in the sense of, well, but then does that mean there's just fewer and fewer reporter jobs because now students are doing that, for free in a sense through class credit, or some of these, citizen journalism models, City Bureau in Chicago, right? I think they get paid in a sense, but if we're relying on students, or we're relying on citizen journalists and getting creative, and we're relying on freelancers, which, yes, I think you see a lot of variety, lots of different voices, but do we also want to protect the local professional journalists that full-time job is to connect with that community and be that resource, right? Or is that something that still has to be important? So hopefully it's all of the above, right? But I know, for my work, I rarely do projects outside of Northern Colorado, right? Because to do this work, you have to have the network and the connections and, all that time to really kind of know people. So for me to kind of go to another community and run a project would be so much more difficult, right? So having those homegrown professional journalists, for me still seems like something that we have to protect, right? While supplementing that with other options. Yeah, Laura?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in the last, I think it's 18 years, Colorado has lost about 24 newspapers. Close to half. The circulation has decreased by more than half, and close to half of the number of reporters. So, I hope we don't wind up framing this. And Martine, you can help us by, introducing the deliberative process, so it's not an either or, freelancers versus full staff, because you need all of it. I mean, CoLab works with more than 270 newsroom journalists, and more than probably, I know we had 50 the last time I looked, is probably more than that, freelancers who collaborate through the Colorado News Collaborative. And so it's definitely an all of the above. Part of the challenge is there are news organizations out there who are operating solely with contractors and freelancers. So they don't have any full-time journalists. And by the way, they wouldn't be eligible for that federal funding if they don't have any full-time journalists. So it's only the full-time journalists who are eligible for that funding. So I would just say, what we need is to figure out ways to bring more people to the table. It's the students, it's the freelancers, it's the staff, and most importantly, it's the community.
And two, I think there are plenty of freelancers who enjoy being freelancers, yet there are lots of freelancers that would love to be a full-time news reporter in a newsroom, and lots of students that would love to graduate out of college directly into a newsroom to get that real life experience and maintain, the specialness of a full-time reporter on staff. So, as we're talking about funding, we're talking about, this history of funding issues throughout the industry. I mean, I think those solutions to the funding side of things and regrowing newsrooms again could kind of present that environment where we have the best of both worlds.
Yeah, Mike, jump on.
Yeah, I'll just add that, the story of the past 20 years has not been freelancers taking over jobs of permanent staff. The story is permanent staff have taken on more and more of the load of getting the publication completed on any given day, and not only that, but just the expectations of permanent staff. I think about all of the Coloradoan reporters. I know them from their work in the paper, but I also know them from their work on places like Twitter and Facebook. So all that work that's expected of a reporter today is exponentially greater than when I was a beat reporter. And so I don't think that's necessarily the problem. I think the demand is greater for information today. And the demand, there's a new book out talking about cheap speech, how the internet had created this market of cheap speech, and it's not necessarily a negative term all the time. But what it means is that it's very, very cheap to post something on Twitter or Facebook, and it can just be a straight opinion. It's expensive to produce journalism. It takes a lot of time and money to produce good journalism. So and the need for that kind of journalism is great. So I think we could think more in terms of a gain model rather than a loss model here. I think there's room for every kind of journalist out there. And I deeply respect, and I have been a freelancer in my time, and I've also been a permanent newsroom reporter. And I just don't know how most publications survive without both, because they both bring really important elements to a newsroom and to a publication. And I'm talking a lot about print, but I think this is true a lot across all the media as well.
One thing that we've talked a lot about internally, particularly Rebecca Powell's the content strategist for the Colorado, and that's on the core team as well. I think she's listening, about the need to kind of rebuild trust, right? There's one source. I just posted the book that you mentioned, Michael, but then Trusting News is one source that we've been using to kind of, really looking at how to rebuild trust. I started off this presentation talking about, part of the democratic crisis is the loss of trust in almost all our institutions, right? So I'm curious if people want to kind of jump on that. Part of that in my head, the connection to the flow is that, having part of what we're learning from Trusting News is the need to people to know their journalists, right? That they're real people, to be out in the community, to know the process and connect. And like Michael was saying, some of the other kind of ways of connecting beyond just the articles, way to do that. But how do we rebuild trust, and how are we working on that at the local level? Laura?
Well, I was just going to suggest, Martine, that maybe we fold in the whole idea of deliberative journalism, if you want to talk a little bit about how that could work in practice. We've talked a lot about, the problem. Let's talk a little bit now. We've got 15 minutes left about the potential solution. How do you think, and I would love to hear Eric's thought on this too. How do we begin to move forward in this process? Because certainly leading conversation is not something most journalists are trained to do.
Yeah,
and I think one of the things that we have to do first for trust is to get a whole lot better at defining what we do for people and letting them inside our newsrooms and our policies and practices. And we've tried that at the Coloradoan in fits and starts, and sometimes just by writing stories about here's how we report on crime in courts, and to just have that base layer of journalism and whatnot. But if people can't see an avenue for being heard and being trusted by us, then this effort will fail, right? Is if they can't look at the Coloradoan and say, this is a place where where I will be given a fair shake, and they're not just predisposed to one way of thinking, and that's the big hump that we have to get over. And I think first, what we have to do is do an even better job, a much better job of saying, again, here's who we are. Here's how we report on your community. Here's what we do. Here's what we don't do. I mean, a lot of my friends, or acquaintances, they, I tell them I'm a newspaper editor, and they say, oh, what are you reporting on Ukraine? And I say, well, that's not what the Fort Collins Coloradoan does. And I think, that's the level that we have to understand as journalists, is to meet everybody at very different degrees of understanding of where we see our jobs versus where they see our jobs, and really work to bring those two together, in a more mutual understanding. And it comes with the humility that the media hasn't traditionally had to listen, and continue to have those conversations. And I'm as guilty as anyone for not doing a good job of that.
Martine, is the idea then with deliberative journalism, I mean, you talked in the beginning a lot about the brain science and how to avoid triggering, the negative digging in kind of behavior that humans are prone to do. Is part of the idea with deliberative journalism that we train journalists how to present facts in a way that won't throw up, that kind of blockage? And if so, how do we do that? How do we begin to do that? I mean, are you going to train Eric's reporters, or how do we? Do we know yet?
Certainly that can be kind of part of what we're kind of thinking about, in a sense of what are some of the specific skills that our facilitators have that kind of work on. I also think of, I'll post this in a second, but I know one of the things that first introduced me to solutions journalism was Amanda Ripley's article on complicating the narrative, right? So she's a journalist that actually got some conflict resolution training and then applied it to journalism. And, and that article really gets at how do you ask different questions and how do you talk about conflict differently? Right, instead of just conflict as this interesting spectacle, right? Of, hey, people are yelling at each other, and here's what they say, and here's what they say. How do you actually kind of analyze the conflict and provide that? So those kind of skills, I think, are really kind of what we're talking about in a way of thinking about. And part of my, the argument that I make about facts, particularly when I talk to experts, right, is a point I made earlier that, facts don't work when we're polarized like this. It doesn't make, so you might have the facts on your side and you might kind of keep on throwing them at people. Some of the actual research shows that the better your facts, often the more it backfires, because the way our brains work. So the idea is more of how do we change the conversation? How do we have a different kind of conversation so it's not, so then facts can work a little bit more, but then it also goes beyond facts. But one thing I'll show you to kind of I want to do this at the end too, we're kind of getting close. So I'm going to share my screen again, just to give you a little bit of a preview. So the next stage in this, so what we're doing the rest of this week, Ashley can kind of post the link to the flyer for these deliberations. Again, part of what we've always done with lots of different issues is we engage the issue, try to make sense of it, get around it, and then somewhat from an outsider perspective, try to kind of create these discussion guides. So we have about a 6-page discussion guide that we created that we'll start using. We got 2 options on Wednesday, 1 on Thursday, 1 on Saturday for this first initial round. This will be small groups with my students on Zoom, allowing people to kind of react to this. This is using what's called a National Issues Forum model. The National Issues Forum is an organization that creates these discussion guides on national issues. That's kind of one of the base models of the CPD. It's a particular framework. I should have put the overall question. The overall question is, how can we reimagine journalism, both so newsrooms can thrive and communities get what they need out of journalism, right? So take on that dual crisis that I talked about. In these NIF forums, the broad question we all agree that is a problem we need to take on, and then it offers 4 approaches. And one important part of this, the approaches aren't choices. It's not like we're going to ask people to vote or kind of pick one of these, but the choices are laid out to ensure a full conversation. And the discussion guide I'll post here in a second has basically 1 page per approach that has some basic arguments, has some specific actions, and then also some inherent trade-offs. Part of the reality, again, of wicked problems is there is no magic bullets, right? There's no right way to fix this. Each of these approaches have some strengths to it, and each of these approaches have some trade-offs and some tensions that we kind of have to explore, right? But this is just kind of one example that we're going to be playing with, to get people talking about this differently. Hopefully we get some people from lots of different perspectives. So we'll get some journalists and some students in there, but also people in the broader community that want to dig in and see a different kind of conversation about this, with the hope of our long-term or short-term goal with this is to get feedback on the document, refine the document, improve it as kind of being something that helps us have conversations. We've designed the document to be somewhat generic community-wise. So as we kind of play with this, we hope other communities can maybe kind of take this and use this to both spark that conversation and then also to start moving to action, to kind of think about, of all these ideas that we'll be sharing, which are some that might kind of jump out at people, right? So yeah, I'm posting a link, that last link. We are getting translated. It'll be translated. We'll have a interpretation for the forums on Thursday and Saturday. So if there's any Spanish speakers that want to be part of the small groups, the Thursday and Saturday ones, did Ashley post the link? Yes, yeah, she posted the link out the flyer for the small group discussions. The RSVP for that, again, for the Spanish speakers, on the top right corner, I think, of the Qualtrics, you can switch it to Spanish, right? So then we have those resources kind of for you as well. But yeah, that's the next step in this conversation, is kind of dig into that, and we'll keep on refining it the next few months, right?
Laura, just to follow up on that a little bit, a couple of things we're talking about is experimenting with the Coloradoans comment section, especially when we do these Coloradoan conversations, for students to be in the conversations, asking follow-up questions, almost being leavening for a more deliberative kind of conversation within them. And then also to start thinking about, and this is, Emma brought this up very early, and I think it's really important to think about what media types might work better for a more deliberative kind of journalism to work. It may not just be the typical news package or the news story that we're used to. There may be a better way to design news for deliberation that doesn't look like traditional, news storytelling. And so we'll be experimenting with a lot of those things to try to, and that's one of the things universities should be doing, is experimenting and seeing what works. And fortunately, we have a lot of good topics up here in Fort Collins to deal with to do that kind of experimentation.
Great. And so, Michael, would the students be helping facilitate deliberation within the newsroom, within public square kind of events where journalists and the public are coming together, or something else that I haven't imagined? Where does that deliberative process take place?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think face-to-face is part of it, and that's why library is a really important part of our partnership. what Martine does as a model is going to be at the center of everything we do. So when we start to take on bigger topics, and he can talk about that, deliberation as we know it will be part of this, and the Coloradoan will be, and other media outlets will be part of that discussion as they have been all along. But also where the students are going to be helpful here, and this is why I think it's important not to just have reporters, is to be trying to push that word out a little further than maybe these traditional models have been pushed, and getting to some of the points that I believe it was Veronica was making in the chat, to find those community liaisons. Martine has a whole concept around this that I think is really interesting. Find those leaders that don't necessarily get marked as leaders in communities, but truly are, and start to get their voices heard more clearly through several outlets. So yeah, those are some of the ideas we're having to get that leavening going.
I think that could be really effective. And I see Veronica is saying in the chat that approach would fit very well with some ethnic cultures. One of the things that we've found really valuable along those lines with CoLab, we have something called the Voices Initiative, where we bring together, I think you may be familiar with it, but just in a nutshell, we've brought together Black voices, Latinx voices, we're bringing together Asian American and Pacific Islander voices, and then after that, Indigenous and Native voices, and have liaisons with the community to help facilitate conversation. And the point of all of that is trying to find concrete recommendations for how media can better serve communities of color, and build that trust. In many cases, build, not rebuild, but build for the first time.
Right.
And new damage, as Martine had pointed out earlier, that's been done. So the liaison idea, I think, is really valuable.
We've also talked, again, this is streaming on FC Public Media, and they're excited about helping us, so we're talking about potentially kind of maybe eventually developing like a weekly news magazine for Northern Colorado that we get people together and kind of talk about it. And a lot of our deliberations, we want everyone to deliberate, right? And I've got the capacity with students to, lots of people show up, and we can split up into small groups. But also what we're trying to do is model a different way of talk, right? One of the problems with our public discourse is the loudest voices are often the ones with the biggest blinders on, right? They're so sure that they're right, so they want to express themselves, and they, so that they send letters to the editor, and they walk up to that microphone at city council, and there's not really a place for people that see some of those tensions and are kind of struggling. Right, so that's what deliberation brings, is it gives a place for people to kind of think out loud, and be a little bit more tied to intellectual humility, like Michael talked about a little bit earlier, about a grant that we're kind of going for to kind of think about that, right? So yeah, so something like this with a deliberation that do you get people that really model, maybe coming from different perspectives, but the goal is not to win the argument. The goal is not to vanquish your adversary, right? But the goal is to help a community really think through an issue in a productive way. So I think we're going to experiment with all of the above, in a sense of how do we just provide places for us to have tough conversations about local issues that help us take on these kind of shared problems better. And tap into all the resources. We've got a question about League of Women Voters of potentially kind of helping. Yeah, we'll take any communities need their civic organizations. They need their mediating or their bridging institutions that bring us together. We've got so many forces that are pushing us apart. How do we identify those organizations and institutions that can bring us together and help kind of reinforce them? And with that, I see it is 8 o'clock, and I want to kind of honor people's time. I do, so Ashley just kind of put the link to the upcoming events. We'll kind of keep on updating that page if you're interested. But I hope to see some of y'all in the deliberations starting Wednesday. So we're 4 options. They're all the exact same process. There'll be a different conversation with different people if people want to do more than one. But you'll get a chance of looking what deliberations like, and also dig in a little bit more to this idea of how do we reimagine local journalism. So I want to thank all the panelists again for your time, and for the audience for the great questions. And I hope to see all of y'all again.
Thanks, Martine. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.